The Boeing 747 absolutely revolutionised civil aviation, and this aircraft behind me is the first one, the prototype that first flew in 1969. And in this video I'm going to take you on a detailed tour of it. We're going to walk around the outside and I'm going to point out what makes it unique and interesting, and then we're going to crawl inside and see what it's like in there. So let's get into it. I'm Paul Stewart and I make videos about planes. This includes reviews of flights from around the world and tours through significant civil and military aircraft in museums. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook. Now, this aircraft was only recently restored after being left to decay for several years, and it's a huge credit to the staff here at the Museum of Flight in Seattle, as it looks absolutely brilliant. Boeing expected that their supersonic airliners would be preferred by customers, therefore the 747 was planned to be a freighter, hence why the cockpit was up higher, as it enabled the whole nose to open up, allowing easy access for the freight. As we all know, the Boeing 2707 was cancelled, and the 747 went on to be the huge success. You see many different airline logos, including Pan Am here, and they were the launch customer, ordering 25 747-100s in April 1966. You can make out the Kangaroo of Qantas, and for several years their entire fleet was actually made up of jumbo jets exclusively, and they only recently retired their final 747-400ERs 2 years ago. The prototype was known as RA001 and named the City of Everett, which was where the massive new factory was built to assemble it. Now, the footage doesn't do it justice, but it really is a tall aircraft, and you can only imagine how impressed everyone would have been when they thought that the DC-8 or a 707 were big planes at the time. Now, don't get confused, because this wing here is a 727, and I'll be making a separate video around that, but comparing the size of it to the 747's wing really shows how big the jumbo jet was. Being such a huge aircraft meant that it was going to need a much more impressive landing gear. There's 4 main landing gear legs with 4-wheel bogies, and it was designed so that it could land on only 2 of them being deployed on opposite sides. In December 1969, during flight tests, the pilot undershot the runway and the outer landing gear was ripped off. Then also in 2014, a Virgin Atlantic 747-400 landed with the starboard landing gear still retracted due to a malfunction, and there's great footage of that on YouTube. In both instances, the aircraft was able to land safely on the 3 remaining gears. It's a beefy looking landing gear, but no surprise when the maximum takeoff weight was over 360 tons on this model, and that increased to over 480 tons on the latest 747-8 model. We'll make our way further back. This massive door here provides access into the aft cargo hold, just underneath the flight deck. As well as carrying a lot of people, the 747 also carried a lot of freight. Several airlines also installed lower level galleys where food could be prepared and then lifted up to the passenger decks. This allowed for ever important space, for more passenger seats, and therefore more tickets could be sold. This was especially useful in the earlier 747s that had much smaller upper decks. Being a massive aircraft meant that it required an auxiliary power unit to generate both pneumatic and electrical activity on the ground, without the main engines being turned on. Here's an example of one of these turbines, which would normally be located right at the end of the aircraft and exhausted out via a small circular exhaust. The horizontal stabilizers blocks your view of the APU's inlet. And while it has been removed from this aircraft, and I'll show you footage shortly, this was equipped with an air-to-air refueling boom, and the operator could look through here. And back to the horizontal stabilizer, which obviously provides pitch control. And what's interesting is that in the 400 series upgrade, they actually put fuel tanks inside of it. This gave them an even greater range. In fact, the first 747-400 delivered to Qantas flew non-stop from London to Sydney. Now, admittedly, it was a bit of a stretch, and the aircraft was towed to the runway so that the engines could be started there and save every single drop possible. As we walk forward, you'll get a glimpse of the now famous N7470 registration. You'll also get a good view of the wings, which were also massive for the time. These large pods are aerodynamic covers for the flap mechanisms for the triple slotted flaps, which deploy out of the trailing edge, increasing the wing's surface area by over 20% and increase lift by 90%, and I'll explore these in more detail in my 747-400 video. What's especially interesting is that they were having problems with fluttering during testing, but they fixed this by using depleted uranium as counterweights on the wings. In fact, the LL747 freighter that crashed in Amsterdam in 1992 had over 200 kilograms of uranium on board, which made the authorities quite anxious. Another major advance with the 747 was the use of high bypass turbofan engines.
Up until now, turbojet engines would suck in at the front and then propel the air out at the back. Now they would do this, but also add a large fan at the front, which would then be spun by the jet engine and also push air backwards. In fact, now the majority of thrust would come from cold air being pushed by the fan that would bypass the hot core, hence the name bypass. This created more thrust and used less fuel. If you look at this gap here, this is where the cold air would be expelled at great pace, while we move further back towards the end of the engine, and you'll see where the small amount of hot air would also be expelled. In coming decades, the engines would get wider as bigger fans with even bigger bypass ratios were used. These air vents here, which kind of look like the doors on a Ferrari 355, were actually used to allow in cold atmospheric air to cool the pressurized air bled from the engines. Once it's cooled down, it then enters the cabin and is used to maintain pressure. If the pressure builds up too much, these circular devices here will vent some air out and protect the passengers' eardrums. But back to the engines as we walk upstairs. The Pratt & Whitney JT9D program struggled to keep up with the rest of the aircraft's development. In fact, as production built up, there were 20 stranded 747s awaiting the engines that weren't yet ready to be installed. Even the inaugural Pan Am passenger flight had to be delayed by several hours due to engine problems, but fortunately their second 747 had just been delivered the day beforehand, so they swapped that in for the flight from New York to London. Its name was Clipper Victor, and it flew until 1977, where tragically it was involved in a collision in Tenerife with another 747. Entering via door 1 left, we'll first check out the nose, and immediately down below is the MEC, or the main electrical compartment. In my 747-400 tour, I'll actually climb down into this. This provides in-flight access to much of the navigation and electrical equipment, as well as the forward landing gear and even the forward luggage hold. Being a prototype, much of the underlying insulation and cables were on full display. The original design of this aircraft was actually a full-length double-decker, similar to the A380 as you can see with this model, but with a narrow interior with only 8 seats across. There were concerns about the speed of evacuation and also the potential luggage storage, so they went with a single but wider deck and a smaller hump for the flight deck. Remember that the cockpit was directly above us, and these cables here are the flight controls directly connected from the pilot's controls that will move the full length of the aircraft to where the hydraulic actuators and flight surfaces were located. Here's the famous spiral staircase. Now unfortunately this prototype isn't open to the public, so here's footage captured on board a 747-200 which was essentially identical upstairs. Qantas used this space for their famous Captain Cook lounges, and it wasn't until later models that they installed permanent seats. On the prototype it would have had spare seats and equipment here. Turning around, we'll make our way into the cockpit. If you've been inside a modern cockpit, you'll notice that this one doesn't have any of those large screens and all of the displays are dials. And behind the first officer was the flight engineer's position, where they would monitor all of the engine, hydraulic and fuel parameters, leaving the job of flying the plane to the flight crew. While there were autopilot systems, flying was a lot less automated than it is now, so the two pilots would be fairly busy. The flight engineer's position was eventually replaced with computers in the 747-400 model that first flew in 1988. Let's make our way back down the stairs, and more cockpit details can be found in my other videos, and I'll link to them below. Here we are back on the prototype, and as you can see there's no normal seats as you'd see in other 747s. As they'd often be flying with a fairly large crew of engineers, they needed some of the standard luxuries including toilets. You've also got some bench space and kitchen equipment, and the all-important coffee for those caffeine-addicted engineers. In passenger versions, there could also be a galley directly under here, where crews could prepare meals and then send them up a lift to the passenger deck. This prototype was pressurized, but there were no masks that would fall from the ceiling, so each crew carried one of these oxygen cylinders for use in rapid depressurization. You'll see lots of orange cables around, and these were spread all across the aircraft, checking for different pressures and stresses. This information would then come back to these stations manned by an engineer, and all the data would be recorded and explored after the flight. It's actually really interesting to compare the test equipment with the 1940s test equipment in the Hughes H4 Hercules prototype, and I'll link to that video below as well. Now this is really interesting. In fact, the 747 is such a versatile platform that it has been used to test many new engines, including the massive GE9X going into the upcoming 777X. But in 1993, these cables were used when the aircraft tested new and massive engines for the upcoming Boeing 777. These measured multiple parameters, including fuel consumption. Now, looking up at the roof, these huge pipes are all involved in the air conditioning and pressurization system that I mentioned earlier. Considering how big the cabin is, they needed a lot of air to constantly circulate before it was eventually vented out the rear of the aircraft. These barrels over here carried water to help simulate the weight that you'd expect from passengers and crew, and obviously they'd be on both sides of the aircraft to ensure the centre of gravity, but some were removed for this walkway in this display. If you look closely, you'll see those flight control cables that I mentioned earlier. There were multiple cables running along together so that if one breaks, the other can take over the same task. Boeing were a little disappointed that their proposal for the Heavy Logistics System military contract lost, which ended up going to the Lockheed C-5 Galaxy, so they considered the idea of creating an in-air refueling version of the 747. Now, the Air Force did say no, and I must admit that I'm surprised that the idea never took off, although maybe the KC-135 was a little smaller and probably far easier to operate out of smaller airports. Up here on the right is the flight data recorder, also known as the black box, and some other electronic equipment. These red cushions here were obviously for the boom operator and their supervisors, and they would be positioned so that they could look through that glass window. And in the background now is the rear pressure bulkhead. Spinning back around again, you've got this trailing static cone, which would be reeled out around 100 feet from the top of the vertical tail fin and measure the static air pressure and true airspeed while the prototype was flying. Here's a contraption where this wire would be wound up in. Up until March 2022, 1,571 747s had been built, and many are still flying to this day. One of the older ones is the VC-25, which is a 200 series and carries the President of the United States. If you're a fan of the Boeing 747, then make sure you check out my other detailed tours through a retired 747-200 and a 400 series, where I'll be crawling through the MEC storage holds and having a closer look at the flight decks. Thanks for watching.